The room went dead silent when she didn't flinch. Elena Martinez moved through Seattle General's ICU at 0600 hours like someone calculating firing angles, though nobody here knew that, and nobody could know that. Her scrubs were wrinkled in places a civilian nurse wouldn't allow. Her badge hung crooked. She kept her eyes down. She spoke only when spoken to, her voice soft enough that physicians had to lean in to hear her. It was the perfect mask. Behind it, she was tracking 6 patient vitals simultaneously, noting the security camera blind spots on the 3rd floor, and assessing the chest X-ray on the light box with the clinical precision of someone who'd read field medicine in the back of a Humvee under mortar fire. The antiseptic smell hit first, that sharp chemical sting mixed with something else, something organic and broken. Floor wax. Dried blood underneath the corners where the mop never quite reached. Elena's nostrils flared once. Just information. Just data. She'd smelled worse in Ramadi. Much worse. Her left leg carried a faint limp when she thought no one was watching. A 7.62 round through the quadriceps, 2008, FOB shank. It had healed wrong because she'd kept working for 6 days before the medics found her. Now it was just part of the cover. Civilians got wounded too. Civilians limped. Nobody asked follow-up questions about a nurse's old injury. They looked away. The ICU stretched out before her, 8 beds, 7 occupied, fluorescent lights humming that low frequency that made your teeth itch if you let it. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm. Heart monitors beeped in overlapping patterns like some kind of a rhythmic symphony. One of the patients, bed 3, Mr. Kowalski, sepsis, day 4 post-op, was going to crash by 2 p.m. His lactate was climbing. His urine output had dropped to 18 milliliters per hour. Elena had already noted it on her mental checklist. She'd mention it to the on-call resident in exactly 30 minutes, right at shift change, when it would look like standard nursing assessment and not like she was running the show. That was the hard part. Looking incompetent while being the most competent person in every room. Elena's hand moved to the inside of her jacket, not her clinical jacket, but her regular one hanging in her locker. She could feel it through the fabric, a faded Special Forces unit patch, sewn in with irregular stitches during a sandstorm in 2017, worn soft from being touched every single morning before shift for 7 years. Nobody knew it was there. Nobody knew what it meant. The patch had been given to her by a man who was supposed to be dead, who'd pressed it into her palm as his eyes closed and the dust of Ramadi covered them both like a shroud. Marcus Chen. Room 340. The blind veteran who hadn't spoken in 23 days. Elena finished checking vitals on bed 2 and moved toward his room with the measured pace of a standard ICU nurse, not rushing, not dawdling, just competent and invisible. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she crossed the threshold. Room 340 was quieter than the others. No family photographs on the bedside table. No get-well cards taped to the window. Just a man in his early 40s, lying with his head turned toward the wall, unseeing eyes open to nothing. Marcus Chen had been decorated for Valor 12 times. He'd led a communication squad through 3 tours. In Ramadi, his unit had intercepted something they shouldn't have, radio chatter about a weapons trafficking pipeline moving through the city, weapons that would eventually end up financing operations Pentagon intelligence was still very concerned about. He'd recorded fragments. Just enough. The kind of evidence that made you a target with a lifespan measured in weeks. Elena had been embedded with his unit. That was her actual mission, not nursing, not yet. Just a Marine Corps officer attached to MARSOC Charlie platoon, watching. Protecting. The tattoo on his forearm was her call sign. Ulsamt Ul-Qatil. The silent killer. He'd gotten it in a shop in Fallujah the day before they found the first weapons cache. Insurance, he'd said, showing her the fresh ink. So I remember the name of the person who's going to kill me if I screw this up. He'd meant it as a joke. Neither of them had understood it would become literal. That was why she was here now, 2,000 miles from the Pentagon, working an ICU shift at Seattle General under her civilian name with a civilian nursing license that technically wasn't a crime to use because she really was a trauma nurse. The military just didn't advertise that fact in her personnel file. Marcus had been admitted 8 weeks ago after what the charts called a traumatic brain injury with complex PTSD. What the charts didn't say was that he'd been grabbed outside a VA clinic in Denver by people asking questions about Ramadi. He'd fought back. They'd thrown him from a moving vehicle at 43 miles per hour. He'd lost consciousness immediately. When he woke up 3 days later in this ICU, his vision was gone and half his memories had scattered like shrapnel. He didn't remember Elena. That was the cruelest part. The injury had taken her from his mind while leaving her name permanently etched on his skin. She checked his for fluids, running at 125 milliliters per hour, and noted the slight swelling in his left wrist. Early contracture. Without physical therapy, his joints would lock within months. But Marcus refused to participate. He just lay there with his head toward the wall, speaking to no one, moving only when necessary. The physical therapists had given up. The psychiatrist had documented severe depression with resistance to intervention. Nobody understood that he wasn't depressed. He was terrified. He knew something. He'd survived having his brain rattled until important pieces fell out, but some deep part of him, the part that had stayed alive in Ramadi, knew that whoever had thrown him from that vehicle was still looking for him. And the Pentagon had sent Elena to keep him breathing until they figured out what the next move was. She reached down and gently checked his carotid pulse. His skin was warm. Pulse steady at 72. His pupils still didn't track light, that damage might be permanent, but his respiratory pattern was even, his oxygen saturation holding steady at 96%. She made a note in the chart, using medical terminology that masked what she was really tracking: neurological stability, contamination risk, probability of another attack if the perpetrators discovered he was still alive. The shoes hit tile before she heard the voice. Click! 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 Expensive leather on linoleum, a rhythm that sounded like someone walking on people's chests. Dr. Hayes Pierce arrived for morning rounds with the kind of presence that made nurses suddenly find tasks on the opposite side of the ward. He was tall, built like a man who'd never skipped a workout, with salt and pepper hair that probably cost more to maintain than Elena's entire monthly salary. His tie was Italian silk. His watch was a Rolex Submariner, 42mm, stainless steel. She'd noted it on his first day, probably a gift for his first six-figure settlement lawsuit. Pierce was chief of surgery at Seattle General, which meant he had authority over nearly every bed in this ICU. More importantly, he had authority over the nurses. And Pierce, Elena had learned in her first week, did not like nurses who looked confident. She didn't look confident now. She looked up from Marcus's chart with something close to deference, her posture softening into the curve that made her smaller. "Good morning, Doctor." "Nurse Martinez." He drew out her name like he was tasting something bitter. "Let's discuss your charting techniques." Elena closed the chart. She had perhaps 90 seconds before this became a problem. Pierce stepped into the room and Elena noticed the way his eyes flicked across Marcus, patient of no particular importance, blind, refusing therapy, occupying a bed, and then dismissed him entirely. That was fine. Most people dismissed people who didn't make eye contact. It was one of Marcus's better defenses now. "Your notes are overly detailed," Pierce continued, positioning himself between Elena and the door. "Not threatening, exactly. Just making sure she understood he controlled the exit. Nursing isn't diagnosis. Your job is to follow orders, not suggest alternatives." Elena took one measured breath. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor alarm sounded and then stopped, someone else's crisis, for now. "I understand, Doctor." Her voice came out soft, deferential. The voice of someone who knew she was outranked. "I'll adjust my charting." "See that you do." He smiled then, and it was the smile of a man who'd just confirmed what he suspected. This nurse could be managed. This nurse knew her place. And stay out of the way during rounds. We don't need commentary from the floor staff. He left the room. Click. 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 Elena's jaw tightened for exactly 1 second. Then it released. She looked back at Marcus, who still hadn't moved, whose blind eyes were still pointed at the wall. Well, she said quietly, in a voice only he would hear, that's going to be a problem. Marcus's fingers twitched against the bed rail. Just barely perceptible. But Elena saw it. He'd heard her voice. Some part of him, the part that had kept him alive through 3 tours and a weapons trafficking conspiracy and 8 weeks in a hospital bed, had recognized something in her tone. Not her face. He couldn't see faces anymore. But something deeper. Elena pulled up the 4-pump on her phone and photographed the settings. She'd file them in the secure server later, encrypted with a cipher key that only Pentagon security had. Standard monitoring. Standard protocol. Nobody would ever know she was documenting Marcus's condition for a classified watch list. She moved back toward the door, pausing at the threshold. Through the window in the corridor, she could see Dr. Pierce at the nurse's station, laughing with one of the residents about something. His hand was resting on the desk with that casual authority of someone who assumed permanent ownership of whatever space he occupied. Elena touched the faded patch through the fabric of her jacket, the one Marcus had given her years ago, the one he'd forgotten but his hands apparently still remembered. The real rounds hadn't even started yet. The projector hummed to life, and Elena's handwriting appeared on the screen in 20-point font. Grand rounds. Thursday morning. Seattle General's conference room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of a space where power dynamics calcified into ritual. 20 residents sat in tiered rows. For attending physicians occupied the front section. Dr. Pierce stood at the podium with Elena's chart notes displayed behind him like evidence at trial. This, Pierce said, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being right, is what I call cowboy nursing. Elena sat in the back row, spine against the wall. Tactical positioning. Habit. Nurse Martinez here apparently believes her 2-year degree trumps our decades of medical training. Pierce tapped the screen. His wedding ring caught the projector light. Look at this medication suggestion. Completely contradicting my direct orders. Where did you get your MD, Nurse Martinez? A cereal box? Laughter rippled through the residents like a contagion. Young doctors performing deference for the attending who controlled their evaluations, their references, their futures. Elena had seen this before, different uniform, same hierarchy. Different rank structure, identical fear. She kept her hands folded. One measured breath through her nose. Pierce continued, voice syrupy with contempt. This is dangerous practice. This is the kind of thinking that gets patients killed. When I give an order in my ICU, that order is executed. Not questioned. Not second-guessed by someone with a stethoscope and a superiority complex. The residents laughed again. Louder. Hungrier. Elena's jaw tightened slightly. That was all. A single tear escaped her left eye, not from emotion, but from the pressure of keeping her face completely still. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Pierce, her movement precise as a surgical instrument. The tear removal looked like contempt, not distress. It looked like a person who had decided she was done. Pierce's face darkened. Something funny, Nurse Martinez. No, doctor. Her voice came out in 2 syllables. Flat. Lethal in its quietness. You care to explain these chart notes? These suggestions you made without authorization. Elena stood. Slowly. The room's air pressure seemed to shift. 23 medical professionals felt something change, though none of them would have been able to articulate it. She moved toward the front with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had walked toward gunfire. Colonel Marsh trusted me with his life in Ramadi. Her voice remained level, each word separated by a space. I held a field hospital together under mortar fire for 6 hours. I still carry that weight. Even if you never will. The silence was absolute. Not the tense silence of a reprimanded employee. The silence of a room that had just heard something it wasn't equipped to process. Pierce's jaw worked. His face went from purple to a shade of red that suggested his blood pressure had crossed into stroke territory. Ramadi? You're telling war stories now? Next you'll claim you're a secret general. G.I. Jane here thinks she's a commando. He laughed. It sounded like a cough. Back to your station, Nurse Martinez. And we're not finished discussing your continued employment. Elena returned to her seat without expression. The word commando would follow her through the hospital's hallways for the next 72 hours. It would be shortened to G.I. Jane by afternoon. By evening, it would become her identifying nickname among residents who didn't know her actual name. This was how institutional power worked, not through logic, but through repetition, through the weaponization of laughter, through the transformation of competence into arrogance. The rounds continued for another 40 minutes, but the projection stayed on Elena's charts. Pierce referenced them for more times, each time finding new angles of criticism. A medication dose that was overly aggressive. A documentation style that was imprecise. A clinical decision that was reckless. The residents took notes. They would remember this. They would remember that Elena Martinez was the kind of nurse who created problems, who didn't respect hierarchy, who needed to be managed. Wednesday afternoon, Elena passed the vending machines on B-Wing. The hallway was narrow, the machines humming in that particular way that made the space feel smaller than it actually was. Two physicians she had never met, Dr. Keller and Dr. Ramos, she would learn their names later, positioned themselves on either side of the machine, creating a corridor she would have to pass through. There goes Pierce's problem child, Keller said. His voice was loud enough to carry. Intentionally. Heard she thinks she's some kind of combat hero, Ramos added. Probably watched too many movies. They both made kissing sounds. Not quite mockery, not quite predatory. Something in between that existed in the precise space where professional harassment became plausibly deniable. Pierce says she's dangerous, Keller continued. Can't follow orders. Thinks rules don't apply to her. Elena kept walking. Her hand did not stop at the vending machine. Her pace did not change. One measured breath. Her eye stayed forward, tracking the exit 20 feet ahead like a target acquisition system. She did not turn around. This was composure. Not the absence of rage, but the presence of absolute control. Her hands were steady because every muscle in her body had learned to absorb impacts that would have destroyed other people. The trembling wasn't absent, it was channeled downward, into the earth through her shoes, converted into forward motion. That evening, Elena texted her handler in Colorado Springs, hostile environment escalating. Maintain protocol. Response came in 90 seconds, maintain cover. Do not engage. Report any direct threats to primary. Primary meant Marcus Chen. The blind veteran in room 340. The man whose forearm bore her name in ink, a memorial to someone he could no longer remember. Wednesday afternoon shifted into evening, into night, into the particular darkness of a hospital after visiting hours ended. The ICU transformed into something quieter, something that belonged to the night shift and the critically ill. Elena moved through the corridors like a ghost, like someone who had learned to exist in spaces without being observed. She had been doing this for 2 years, moving through Seattle General, monitoring Marcus Chen, documenting his vital signs and his psychological state, waiting for Pentagon intelligence to clear her for the next phase of her actual mission. That's when Pierce appeared. He entered the ICU at 11:36 p.m., unusual for a chief of surgery. The fluorescent lights above the nursing station flickered in that tired way they did when the hospital tried to conserve electricity at night. Pierce went directly to room 340. He didn't knock. He didn't check the monitor. He stood in the doorway for exactly 14 minutes, reading charts, looking at Marcus Chen's face like he was searching for something written in the patient's features. Elena documented everything from the nurse's station. Time of arrival. Duration. The fact that Pierce touched nothing, spoke to no one, asked no questions. When he left, he moved with purpose. With calculation. This was Pierce in stage 3 of his escalation, not just mocking her anymore, but strategically circling, gathering intelligence, preparing to weaponize whatever he found. She texted her handler again, primary subject drawing institutional attention. Advise immediate. For minutes passed. Then, maintain cover. Do not compromise mission. Field Office Colorado Springs standing by. Elena understood what that meant. If Pierce compromised her position, if he somehow discovered that the quiet nurse he was trying to destroy was actually a Pentagon operative assigned to protect a witness in a classified case, the situation would escalate beyond her authority to manage. They would extract her. The mission would collapse. Marcus Chen would lose the one person who understood what had happened to him in Ramadi, the one person who could help him reconstruct the memory his traumatic brain injury had stolen. She could not let that happen. That night, Elena made her rounds with even greater precision than usual. She checked Marcus Chen every 20 minutes. She documented his vital signs, his mental status, the tiny movements his hands made when she wasn't looking directly at him. His breathing was steady. His oxygen saturation held at 97%. His heart rate tracked normal, 64 beats per minute, the rhythm of someone sleeping without nightmares. But that wasn't the worst part. On Thursday morning, 3 hours into her shift, Marcus Chen's breathing began to change. Elena caught it first, a subtle shift in his respiratory pattern, the kind of thing that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 3 tours in field hospitals learning to read the small signs that preceded catastrophe. The room was darkening at 2:24 a.m. in a way that had nothing to do with the night shift. Elena stood at the medication cart outside Marcus Chen's room when she caught it, a shift in his breathing pattern, subtle as a pressure change in a descending aircraft. Most nurses wouldn't notice. Most nurses hadn't spent 3 tours learning to read the small signs that preceded catastrophe. She moved into room 340 without hesitation. Marcus lay motionless against the pillows, his chest rising in quick, shallow gasps instead of the steady rhythm from her last check 40 minutes ago. His lips were pale. The skin around his neck had tightened, and when Elena stepped closer, she saw his neck veins distended like cables pulling against his throat. His trachea had deviated slightly to the right, barely perceptible unless you'd been trained to catch it before it killed someone. Tension pneumothorax. Air pocket crushing his lung. Elena's hand moved to the call button with the casual efficiency of someone ordering breakfast. Code Blue setup, room 340, she said into the intercom, her voice flat as a heartbeat monitor. Then she paged the on-call physician without waiting for a response, her fingers already moving toward the crash cart. Marcus's oxygen saturation glowed on the monitor, 84% and dropping. She didn't wait for the physician. She knew how this went. Marcus, she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd given orders in 3 languages across 2 continents. I'm going to help you breathe now. His one functioning hand reached out blindly, fingers grasping at nothing. Elena took it for exactly 1 second, long enough for him to feel he wasn't alone, then released it and moved. She prepped the second intercostal space with the precision of surgical theater, her hand steady as a laser. The betadine swab was cold. The 14-gauge needle from the crash cart felt familiar in her palm the way a rifle feels familiar to a soldier who's carried the same model for a decade. The oxygen monitor read 79%. 5 minutes had passed since she'd paged. The physician would be in the ER still, the trauma bay consuming his attention, and Marcus was turning blue in the dark. Elena could wait for transport, the protocol demanded it. The hospital policy demanded it. Dr. Pierce's authority demanded it. Her handler's voice was still in her head from the mission briefing, do not compromise your cover. Do not compromise the operation. Marcus gasped. His chest heaved once, twice, the effort of a man drowning in air. Elena swabbed the needle insertion point a second time, muscle memory from Ramadi, from a field hospital in the Jolin district where morphine was scarce and speed was everything. She positioned the needle at the midclavicular line, felt the anatomical landmarks beneath her fingers like reading Braille. The skin here had been punctured countless times before. Her hands had done this in the back of a Humvee while rounds punched through the metal hull like angry insects. She pushed the needle through his ribs. The resistance gave way with a sensation like puncturing a coffee can. Then came the hiss, that unmistakable exhalation of trapped air releasing into freedom. The sound was identical to what she'd heard in Ramadi, identical to what she'd heard in the desert during the medevac when she'd held pressure on Colonel Marsh's femoral artery and he'd stopped screaming because shock had already taken him somewhere else. The monitor beeped. Saturation climbed, 80. 82, 85. 89. Marcus's breathing immediately deepened, the frantic gasping replaced by something resembling the rhythm of a man who could draw air into his lungs again. Color returned to his lips like a photograph developing. His hand relaxed against the mattress. Elena kept the needle steady, her presence in the room a cold, controlled force that needed nothing from anyone. She secured the needle with tape, documented the procedure in his chart with clinical precision, time of insertion, needle gauge, immediate response, oxygen saturation restoration, then paged the on-call physician again. Needle decompression performed for tension pneumothorax, room 340. Patient stable. Report when available. The physician called back 8 minutes later. Status. Breathing normalized, Elena said. O2 sat at 94%. Breath sounds bilateral. A pause. Good work. The words landed like an echo from someone else's life. Elena hung up the phone and stood beside Marcus Chen's bed, watching his chest rise and fall in the darkness. His blind eyes were closed, his face serene in the way of someone who'd just been pulled from drowning. The tattoo on his forearm, her full name in capital letters, inked there 7 years ago as his field medic was dragging him toward a helicopter in a shower of brick dust, meant nothing to him anymore. His traumatic brain injury had erased her face from his memory entirely. But his body remembered her? She didn't need to hear it said. She could read it in the way his breathing had synchronized with her presence, the same way a patient's heart rhythm synchronized with a clinician they trusted. Some things lived deeper than memory. Some things lived in muscle and bone and the unconscious calculus of survival. Elena straightened his blankets, checked his 4 lines, and moved toward the doorway. The hospital would sleep for another few hours. Dr. Pierce would arrive at 6 a.m. with his customary cold coffee and his customary contempt. He would eventually learn what had happened at 2:19 a.m. in room 340. He would find the documentation. He would see the procedure name and the timestamp and the patient outcome. And he would recognize exactly what that meant. The corridor was silent, that specific 3 a.m. hospital silence where the fluorescent lights hummed their electric frequency and the only other sound was the distant beeping of monitors on the other ward. Elena walked back to the medication cart and logged her notes with the methodical focus of someone completing a shift report, not someone who'd just stepped outside every protocol her employer had designed. The documentation was pristine. The notes would speak for themselves. She didn't flinch at what was coming. She didn't calculate the consequences or the fallout or the way this single intervention would trigger a cascade of institutional retaliation. She simply moved through the remaining hours of her shift with the same quiet efficiency that had kept her alive through 3 tours in regions where quiet efficiency was the only thing that separated heartbeats from headstones. At 5:11 a.m., Elena sat in the break room with cold coffee she didn't drink, and her phone buzzed once, a text from her handler that said only, "Saw the chart note. Options being evaluated." The meaning was clear. The operation was compromised. Saving Marcus Chen's life had just become an act of war against her own mission. Elena set the phone down, picked up her coffee, and didn't drink it. Instead, she watched the darkness outside the break room window begin to thin toward morning, toward the moment when Dr. Pierce would clock in and the full weight of her decision would begin to materialize into institutional consequence. She was ready. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that when Pierce found out, and he would find out, his first response wouldn't be gratitude for a life saved. It would be calculation. Strategy. The kind of competent, methodical retaliation that came from a man who'd learned long ago that the best way to destroy someone was through the very systems designed to protect people. Elena finished her shift at 7 a.m. She wrote her hand-off notes with meticulous care, every detail accounted for, every medication dosage documented, every intervention logged in the system where it lived now, permanent evidence that Captain Elena Martinez had broken protocol to save the life of a blind veteran who couldn't remember her face. She clocked out at 7:15 a.m. Dr. Pierce walked past her in the corridor at 7:18 a.m., his expression unchanged. He didn't know yet. But he would. And when he did, everything she'd worked for across 2 years of careful infiltration, careful documentation, careful restraint would either justify itself in the aftermath, or it would all collapse into the kind of silence that follows a career imploding. Elena kept her composure. Kept her voice level. Kept her hand steady. The rest would come soon enough. By 8:11 a.m., Dr. Pierce knew. The night shift charge nurse had left a note on his desk, a single line that made his jaw clench, patient in 340 extubated successfully post-needle decompression. Vital signs stable. Performed by N. Martinez without physician authorization. He read it 3 times. Each time, his breathing shallowed. She'd gone around him. She'd gone around protocol. She'd gone around the entire institutional hierarchy that kept people like her in their lane, and she'd done it in the dark where witnesses were minimal and documentation was her word against his. But documentation was traceable. Documentation was his weapon. Pierce sat at his mahogany desk, the one that faced the window overlooking Seattle's skyline, and made the first call at 8:52 a.m. Board Chairman Gerald Hutchins answered on the second ring, still on the golf course by the sound of the wind. "Jerry, we have a problem." Pierce's voice was smooth, conversational. "That contract nurse I mentioned, Elena Martinez. She performed an invasive procedure last night without physician authorization. Tension pneumothorax needle decompression. She didn't wait for the attending. She just went ahead and did it." A pause. Wind whistled across the line. "Is the patient alive?" Hutchins asked. "Unfortunately." "Then she saved a life." "She violated protocol," Pierce said, his voice hardening like concrete setting. "That's what matters. That's what we address. The hospital cannot have nurses making independent decisions about surgical intervention. It opens us to liability. Creates a culture of insubordination." Another pause, longer this time. "Handle it," Hutchins said, and the line went dead. By 9:04 a.m., Pierce was dialing the compliance officer. Sandra Kovac picked up immediately. She always did, always available, always eager to please the chief of surgery who controlled her department's budget. "Sandra, I need an external investigator brought in today. Stat. I want every chart that Elena Martinez touched in the last 6 months audited. Look for deviations. Look for protocol violations. Look for anything we can use." "Dr. Pierce, that's quite extensive." "Do it." By 9:11 a.m., his attorney picked up on the first ring. Thomas Whitmore, $450 per hour, had known Pierce since medical school. They'd interned together at Johns Hopkins, had celebrated Pierce's first fellowship together. Whitmore owed Pierce favors. Many favors. "Tom, I need termination documentation prepared. Insubordination. Protocol violations. Inability to work within established medical hierarchy. I want it airtight. And I want it today. That's fast. That's what I'm paying you for." By 10:34 a.m., Pierce had contacted 3 professors from Elena's nursing school at the University of Washington. He called them personally, his voice saturated with concern, dripping with a kind of regret that sounded like professional responsibility. "I'm calling about one of your former students. Elena Martinez. She graduated, 15 years ago. I'm concerned about her judgment. Her inability to accept direction. She's made several decisions here that I'd characterize as reckless. I wondered if you'd noticed similar patterns during her clinical training. The professors hemmed. They equivocated. But they listened. And once you plant a seed of doubt in an academic's mind, it takes root. By 11:02 a.m., the outside investigator, a thin woman named Dr. Rebecca Chen, hired through an agency that Pierce had used before for exactly these situations, was already in the medical records department, pulling files. 6 months of charts. 6 months of documentation. 6 months of ammunition. Elena arrived for her shift at 11:58 a.m., still wearing the combat boots she'd never quite managed to hide beneath her scrub pants, her ID badge clipped to her collar, coffee cup in her left hand. She stepped into the break room and saw Dr. Pierce waiting by the lockers. With hospital security. With HR Director Michael Brennan. The room tilted. Not visibly. Not on her face. The training kicked in, the same training that had kept her breathing under mortar fire, that had steadied her hands during field surgery, that had taught her how to absorb a punch without flinching. One measured breath. Then another. Nurse Martinez, Brennan said, reading from a document he held at arm's length like it might burn him. You are terminated effective immediately for repeated protocol violations and inability to work within established hierarchy. Specifically, you performed an invasive surgical procedure, needle decompression of a tension pneumothorax, without physician authorization. You have demonstrated insubordinate behavior on multiple occasions. You represent a liability this hospital cannot afford. Elena set her coffee cup down on the locker bench. Carefully. Deliberately. Like she was setting down a piece of evidence. I saved his life, she said. His oxygen saturation was 79. His trachea was deviated. He had minutes. That's not your decision to make, Pierce said, stepping closer. His smile was thin as a knife blade. You should have known your place, G.I. Jane. The silence stretched like a held breath. Elena's jaw clenched, not with anger, but with the effort of restraint. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the compressed force of someone who could have ended this conversation 3 different ways and had chosen to end it 0 ways. She unclipped her badge without looking at Pierce. Handed it to Brennan. The badge swung between them like a pendulum, blue and white plastic suddenly feeling like a crown she was abdicating. I want my personnel file, Elena said. Everything. Today. That won't be possible until. Today, she said, and her voice had dropped an octave. It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement that made air molecules rearrange themselves. The security guard, a tired man named Mitchell with 22 years on the job, gestured toward the door. Elena walked. Mitchell walked beside her, not close enough to touch, professional enough to understand he was witnessing something he didn't have the context to comprehend. They passed through the ICU. Heads turned. Whispers scattered like startled birds. Pierce followed them to the main entrance, his hand landing on Elena's elbow as they reached the glass doors. Possessive. Victorious. A man who had just won a game he'd invented the rules for. This is over, he murmured. Whatever you thought you were, whoever you thought you were, it's finished. Elena stepped into the afternoon sunlight without answering. The doors hissed closed behind her. Mitchell stood inside, watching her walk across the parking lot, her gait unchanged. No stumble. No rush. Just the steady pace of someone who had already survived worse than this. But survival wasn't the mission. Marcus Chen was the mission. And he was inside that hospital, unprotected, monitored only by standard ICU protocols while a blind veteran with classified knowledge sat in a room where Pierce had access to his charts, his vitals, his vulnerabilities. Elena drove east on Interstate 90. The sky was the color of hammered steel. Rain had started falling an hour ago, the kind of rain that hammered the windshield like it had a grievance. She passed Snoqualmie. Past North Bend. Kept driving until the city lights disappeared in her rearview mirror and there was nothing but evergreens and darkness and the sound of her own breathing. She found a diner called Martha's just off the highway in a town whose name she didn't register. The coffee was cold before she finished the first cup. The booth smelled like bacon grease and someone else's regret. She sat facing the door, always facing the door, staring at her reflection in the window glass. 6 missed calls from a number she'd memorized but never stored in her phone. Her handler. Her commanding officer. Someone 200 miles away who was starting to realize that his 2-year operation had just collapsed in one predetermined moment because a nurse in a hospital ICU couldn't watch a patient die. She pulled out her phone. Put it down. Pulled it out again. If she called, she'd have to explain. If she explained, she'd have to confirm that the operation was compromised. If the operation was compromised, then Marcus Chen, the witness, the asset, the living testament to what he'd seen in Ramadi, would have to be extracted immediately. Which meant her cover wouldn't matter anymore. Which meant everything she'd sacrificed over 2 years would convert into a single data point: mission failed due to operator emotional compromise. The rain kept falling. The reflection in the window kept staring back at her with eyes that looked like they belonged to someone else. Someone who'd chosen a patient over a mission. Someone who'd broken protocol to save a life. Someone who was about to find out that breaking protocol was exactly what the Pentagon had been waiting to see. For days later, Sarah Chen's voice crackled through Elena's phone at 7 a.m. "He's asking for you. He said your name, Elena. He's speaking for the first time in weeks." The words hit like a defibrillator paddle. Elena sat up in the empty apartment she'd rented in Colorado Springs, coffee forgotten on the nightstand, her hand steady even as everything tilted. Marcus. Speaking. Asking for her by name, a name his traumatic brain injury had erased from his memory 7 years ago, even though her full name covered his left forearm in permanent ink. She was on the road in 18 minutes. Seattle General's ICU smelled like disinfectant and possibility when she walked through those doors at 11:22 a.m. The hallway to room 340 felt longer than she remembered, her civilian scrubs hanging loose on shoulders that had learned to carry weight differently. But it wasn't Marcus's room she was walking toward. Not first. The hallway was crowded. That was wrong. That was dangerous. Nurses didn't cluster in ICU hallways unless something had shifted. Elena moved closer, her trained eyes cataloging the scene: Marcus's room overflowing with visitors, 2 military-bearing men in the corridor, and in the adjacent bed, the one that had been empty yesterday, a sedated patient with federal marshals posted outside his door. Someone new. Someone important enough to warrant armed detail. Elena stepped into Marcus's room. The sedated man's eyes opened like a door slamming. His body convulsed. He screamed in Arabic, a sound like glass breaking in a burning building, then switched to English, his voice cracking with terror. "Al-Samt al-Qatl, the silent killer, you were dead, we killed you in Ramadi. We buried you in the Jolan," the monitors shrieked. His oxygen saturation plummeted. A nurse rushed forward with sedatives, but Elena was already reading the feeds. He was spiraling because he recognized her? Because someone in that bed had been part of the cell that tried to kill her on March 14, 2017, at 4:23 a.m. outside a field hospital that shouldn't have existed on any map. A Marine Corps colonel stepped forward from the corner, where he'd been standing so quietly that even Elena's combat-trained peripheral vision had missed him. His uniform was dress blues, immaculate, with a chest full of ribbons that meant 30 years of decisions made in darkness. He held a leather folder. He opened it with the finality of a coffin lid closing on a previous life. "Captain Elena Martinez," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only the room could hear. "Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry under fire. Awarded for actions on March 14, 2017, in Ramadi, Anbar Province, when you held a field hospital against overwhelming enemy combatants for 6 hours. 3 combat medics and 1 18 Delta Army medic were in that structure. You kept them alive. You kept your patient alive." He nodded toward Marcus Chen, whose eyes were now open, tears streaming down his sightless face. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. 2 Purple Hearts. Meritorious Service Medal. Combat Medical Badge with 2 stars. The room wasn't breathing. The fluorescent lights buzzed like distant machinery. Dr. Pierce shoved into the doorway from the hallway, his face mottled with rage. This is nonsense. That woman is a civilian nurse. She doesn't have military credentials. She's a fabrication. An imposter walking around in scrubs. I have documentation. His voice cracked like rotting wood. I have proof. A two-star general stepped forward, blocking Pierce's path with a shoulder movement so subtle it looked like he'd simply shifted his weight. The general's face was carved from weathered stone. He raised his hand in a full military salute, the kind delivered when the person being saluted has earned respect that transcends uniform. "Captain," he said. That was all. One word. A world of recognition. Pierce made a sound like something breaking inside his chest. This is illegal. You can't just, the board chairman will hear about this. I have lawyers. I have documentation of her protocol violations, her reckless endangerment, her complete disregard for. Two men in dark suits entered the room, moving with the economical purpose of people who'd done this before. Federal credentials hung from their necks on lanyards. The senior official, a woman with steel-gray eyes and a scar bisecting her left cheekbone, stepped directly into Pierce's line of sight. "Dr. Raymond Pierce," she said quietly. "You've been under investigation for 18 months for selling patient information to pharmaceutical companies. Specifically, selling veteran medical records to defense contractors looking to suppress testimony about equipment failures that resulted in 17 preventable amputations and 4 deaths. Pierce's face cycled through colors. Red. Purple. White. We've been waiting for Captain Martinez's surveillance work to build a prosecutable case. You made our job easier this morning at 6 a.m. when you accessed classified Defense Department databases using stolen credentials and attempted to forge military service records in Captain Martinez's name. You created false documents designed to discredit a decorated service member. Federal crime. The FBI agent on her left stepped forward, handcuffs already drawn, moving with the inexorable momentum of gravity. "Dr. Raymond Pierce, you're under arrest for falsifying federal documents, wire fraud, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and unlawful access of classified databases. You have the right to remain silent." Pierce started speaking. Words poured out like blood from a wound, denials, threats, invocations of status and power and connections. His voice climbed higher as the FBI agents led him toward the door. "You don't understand who you're dealing with. I'm the chief of surgery at this hospital. My brother-in-law is the district attorney. The board chairman is a personal friend. I've golfed with senators. That woman is nobody, she's just a nurse, and you're destroying my career over what? Her word against mine." The hallway had filled with staff, clustered against the walls like they'd been herded there. Dr. Keller and Dr. Ramos, the two who'd made kissing sounds at the vending machines, pressed themselves into the shadows. They wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. Pierce's protests echoed down the corridor as they walked him toward the elevators. "This is insane. I'm a respected surgeon. This is a setup. I'm calling my lawyer." The FBI agent's voice continued reading rights, dispassionate as a metronome. The elevator doors closed on his face, still contorted with the shock of someone who believed the world was supposed to work a certain way and had just discovered it didn't. Elena turned. Marcus Chen was sitting up in bed now, his shoulders shaking, tears running down his face like rain down reinforced concrete. His hands were reaching, searching, finding air instead of the person he was looking for. Elena moved, not the careful, deferential movement of a civilian nurse, but the direct momentum of a soldier returning to formation. She knelt beside his bed. His hands found her shoulders first, then her face, mapping the topology of 7 years as if he could reconstruct memory through fingertips. His chest heaved. His breath came in fragments. "I knew someone carried me," he whispered. "I knew someone stayed. In the Humvee. You kept saying my name. Marcus, stay with me. Marcus, you're going to walk out of this. I know you will." His voice cracked on each word. "I couldn't see you. But I knew someone was there. Elena pulled the patch from inside her jacket lining, faded now, worn smooth by 7 years of being carried against her heart through ceremonies and surgeries and sleepless nights. The Special Forces insignia was barely visible, the colors bled into each other like watercolor in rain. Marcus had given it to her in March 2017 as his consciousness was slipping away, pressed it into her hand with hands that barely had strength left. "Tell them," he'd said, the last full sentence he spoke before the morphine took him under. "Tell them the truth about what we saw." He held the patch like it was made of light. Sarah Chen gripped Elena's shoulder, her face streaming with tears, saying nothing because there were no words left that weren't already written in blood and sacrifice and the kind of love that doesn't require language. The general explained to the assembled staff how Elena had been on a classified protection assignment, how Marcus had witnessed contractor crimes in Ramadi that reached into the Pentagon itself, how Dr. Pierce had been attempting to access Marcus's medical records for weeks, cross-referencing them against testimony he was trying to suppress. The room was silent except for the mechanical sounds of life support, the ventilators, the monitors, the 4 pumps delivering fluids drop by drop. This was the moment when one life ended and another began. The Navy Cross was already hanging in a vault somewhere with her name on it. The Silver Star was documented. The 2 Purple Hearts were authenticated. 18 months of surveillance work, watching a blind veteran recover his voice, watching a corrupt surgeon destroy his own life through greed, was finally complete. But Elena wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking about March 14, 2017, at 4:23 a.m., when a 19-year-old private named Marcus Chen handed her a worn fabric patch and asked her to carry it, to carry the truth, to carry the weight of what they'd seen so that someone someday would have to answer for it. She was thinking about a diner in Colorado Springs where she sat alone at 3 a.m. thinking her career was over. She was thinking about the needle decompression she'd performed on night shift because she couldn't let a patient die, even if it meant losing her cover. She was thinking about how the quietest decision sometimes changes everything. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever sacrificed recognition for integrity, if you've ever wondered whether the person beside you might be carrying a weight nobody knows about, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another moment like this. These stories matter. The quiet heroes matter. Tell us in the comments, have you ever stood beside someone whose true strength nobody else could see?